when you think about Steve's career, and you work with him so closely at Pixar, why was he so successful?
Well, I'd have to say that over the time I knew Steve, which is 26 years, which was just as he was forced out of Apple, that he went through, I'd say, some very distinct phases. And in the first phases, where he had a sort of a reputation, I think people misunderstood him and what he was doing. But what I found over the time was that he was learning from those mistakes. That the way he negotiated, the way he interacted with people, initially didn't work very well, but he was so incredibly smart that he changed his behavior. And a lot of people didn't get this or didn't see this, but the Steve for the last several years that I knew was very kind. He was very empathetic with people, and when he negotiated, as I saw him do with Disney, there was the notion of fairness and partnership, which is very strong. And those things weren't there earlier, but he was so smart that he learned how to do it.
So part of his success was this adaptability, and eventually the transition to being better able to partner.
Yeah, it was basically, when you test the boundaries, which some people do, and he was a person that did test the boundaries, when you do that, what do you do with it? Or let's take something which you hear a lot about, and it is CEOs would say, my employees are my most valuable asset, and the culture is extremely important. But with Steve, he built a building. And the building, I think, is one of the most extraordinary work environments I've ever seen.
You're talking about the Pixar.
The Pixar building. And this was Steve's design, and it was very cultural. And it was because he thought about what it meant to say that your people were the best and the culture was the best. And it translated into an environment that was unlike what other CEOs would do, who would use the same words. So if you copy Steve, you say, oh, like, people are important, blah, blah, copy all this stuff. But they didn't see what he was really doing, which is a deep understanding, which it turns around and affected what he made, or what he directed.
Larry, why was he so successful?
Well, in addition to his obvious genius, which helps, he had a single-mindedness and an attention to detail unlike anyone I've ever seen. And if you look at he insisted on, and he was a bit of a control freak.
He was?
A little bit, just a little bit. And he wanted to engineer every aspect of the user experience, let's say, for the iPhone, including what happened when you walked into the store, how you paid for it, or how you paid for an iPad with your, how you saw it in the store, obviously you bought it from AT&T, how you paid for an Apple product with your credit card in the store, how if the iPhone was sent to you, or the iPhone was delivered to you, or the iPad was delivered to you, what it looked like in the box, the detail of the box, what it was like to open the box, what you saw when you first opened the box, how you bought an application, how you connected to the network. I mean, every excruciating detail he was personally involved in. I don't think people really understand. Edison had this comment, it's 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration. Steve was a god of perspiration. I mean, Steve worked incredibly hard. It wasn't just his intellectual gifts, which were enormous, but how he took that horsepower and applied it tirelessly until the entire problem was solved. I've never seen anyone like that. He would just not let go of a problem until it was solved. I guess that's the best way to describe it. It's not that he just put in the hour. If he had to stay up all night, if he stayed up night after night after night, he would call me up and say, Larry, let's get together. We saw each other a lot. You come over to my house, I'd go over to his house. I said, Steve, I'm not coming over if you make me watch Toy Story again. I've watched 73 different versions of Toy Story. Now, I know the new version of Render Man is 4% better than the one I saw last week, but I'm not watching this thing again. So, Larry, you got to see. You won't believe the different the shadows look. I don't care. You don't understand. I'm not coming. unless you promise me that you're not going to make me watch. I promise, but just a little of it.
This is before the movie came out.
Before the movie came out, yeah. And that was Steve. And we go over there, and he'd have the mock-up of the Apple stores, and we go over to the warehouse, and Oracle did the software, by the way, for the retail software, and he's just complaining about it to me. Steve, it's Sunday. You're saying how terrible the Oracle software is. I'm in your stupid store in the warehouse. How many times I've come around Sunday, and we're walking through the checkout of but that was Steve until it was perfect. And then once it was perfect, and then he moved on to the next problem. But working obsessively until he had a solution that was insanely great is what Steve was all about. And an idea, I'll go back to the network computer. We had this idea. I had this idea. It's a simple device attached to the internet. I'm now done. Idea now fully formed. Boy, that was a good idea. What do you think, Steve? That's a good idea. Building that thing is really hard. Let me tell you what you have to do. A, B, C, and then Steve then proceeds, to build the iPad. There's a big difference. There's a reason. Ideas, there are a lot of good ideas.
There are a lot of good ideas.
There are a lot of good ideas. Translating a good idea into a great product is unbelievably hard. There are so many details. People accuse Steve of stealing, the Macintosh from Xerox, with the Alto computer. I was at Xerox PARC, so I used the Alto a lot. Finishing the Alto and turning that into the Macintosh was enormously complicated, and there were so many things that had to be done that Xerox had not done. There were a few good ideas in the Xerox machine, but Steve would translate good ideas, not always his good ideas, but he would translate good ideas into finished product, unlike anyone in our industry. Henry Ford didn't invent the car, but he made it cheap, and he made it popular, and he made it accessible to the American people. Steve would translate good ideas into finished, brilliant products.
You advise someone who wanted to model the Steve Jobs career, or the Steve Jobs method, or the Steve Jobs success is basically what they want to model. What would you tell them to do? It could be people in this room. It could be people who will watch this video.
Yeah, to me, trying to copy Steve means they're going to stop at the surface. I think conceptually, copying Steve or emulating Steve is the wrong thing to do. Partly because some people are so unique that to copy them is only to parody them in some ways, in a way that doesn't work. And he truly was unique. You say you try to be like him, what does that mean? I do think there are principles for how you think about things, how you explore the boundaries, how you keep yourself from getting caught up in a conservative way of thinking, and the way you keep yourself from being blind from things. Steve had the facility to do that. Most people don't. And if they can work on their personal view of life and how they tackle problems and how they open themselves up, they'll have a greater result.
Well, I think you cannot copy Steve. I think you can ask yourself some basic questions if you're like him. If there's an unsolved problem and you're at work, can you think about anything else? So if you want to know if you're like Steve Jobs, so if you are unable to think about anything but this problem.
So if you want to go to the movies.
Yeah. And it has nothing to do with being successful. You're not thinking about, oh my God, if I'm Steve Jobs, I can go out with this person, I can date this person, and I can buy this house. And if you think about the benefits of being famous and rich, then you're missing the whole point. If you want to know you're like Steve Jobs, it's very simple. You are unable to think about anything about these serious problems at work, and that's all you can do, and you obsess about it until you solve it, and then you move on to the next thing, and you obsess about that until you solve it, and then you obsess about this until you solve it. It is, that obsessive compulsive personality combined with this incredibly, and obsessive compulsive personalities are not all that rare. among successful people. The obsessive compulsive personality combined with this peculiar genius of Steve's, which was both aesthetic. We talked about the building. He loved architecture and design. He loved. He was an amateur architect. He loved product design.
He wasn't an engineer, though. He wasn't a coder.
He wasn't a programmer. And I'm a programmer, but he had enough knowledge of what went into into the product, whether it was the microprocessor or the operating system. He had a pretty deep knowledge about all of that technology. Very smart boy. He learned very fast. Might not have been a professional programmer, but his understanding of the complete system, the gestalt, the whole thing, the whole system, and how to fit those pieces together. He would take this puzzle and assemble these pieces into the iPad. And there's a lot of complicated software pieces. And he'd work with the engineers, and he was a great editor. He was a wonderful editor, at least in terms of editing the software and user interface as it was developed. He was a great editor of process in the stores. He would constantly review things and continuously make them better until he was marginally satisfied, and then they could release the product. If you have that kind of obsession combined with Picasso's aesthetic and Edison's inventiveness, then you were the next Steve Jobs.
So that's the test.
Easy. Easy. Yeah, this guy's not, when I use.
So there really are no lessons to take from it unless you take that little test and you match up.
No, I think there are a lot of lessons, but to try to model yourself after Steve Jobs. Again, it would be like, well, okay, what do I have to? I'd like to paint like Picasso. What should I do? Should I use more red?
Here's the problem I have with modeling yourself after Steve. Because I remember John and I were up there, and he was showing us the iPhone before it came out. And it was a very emotional time because he talked about his disease and what he wanted to do for Apple and Pixar and for his family. But as he held this phone, he said, the thing that makes this so hard to copy is the software. He made a big deal of that. Now, he loves the design, but the fact is, on the outside, most people talk about it, they say, what makes this so cool is the design. So they're coming out looking at it from the outside, not realizing that the value is something really complex. And I think the same is true for Steve. They come out, and the silly example, of course, is the clothes. But if you look at the superficial things that he did or the peculiarities he had, both positive and negative.
Like his ability to stand on a stage and present
it's the wrong
product
thing.
in a way that...
If that's what you're copying the wrong thing. And there are a lot of lessons, but they're not about the design, as important as design is.
So is one of them...
I commented, it's really interesting that Dell was at the time, Dell was kind of the hot company, and everything was being sold across the internet, and bricks and mortar was just, nonsense, right? It was a joke. And
Gateway has actually just had to close their stores.
Yeah,
they had stores.
And it's just like, Steve must really be stupid. Steve, aren't you reading the newspapers? Everyone, bricks and mortar's dead. And they said, well, we're not using bricks and mortar. We're using glass and steel. Oh, well, that changes everything. I've got this really cool stairway. And you have to love him. The brilliance of not being a follower. The brilliance of being a contrarian, the brilliance of understanding Apple is really a lifestyle brand.